Hello, everyone. My name is Alison Rose Jefferson, and I am a historian and heritage conservation consultant. And I'm really happy to be here today to speak to you about some of the erased history that is in California. So African Americans, and you learned about the name of my lecture today, which is Black Leaders of Leisure in the Struggle for Freedom during the Jim Crow era in the American West, and the implications of the stories for our lives today. Well, this is really very relevant from the standpoint that we've had a lot of different activities going on over the last few months that illustrate how some of African American voices have been erased, and erased from the standpoint of people not understanding that there is racial inequity in our society, and learning about some of these stories would help people to understand these situations a little better. African Americans began moving to Los Angeles in larger numbers in the environs of Los Angeles in the decades surrounding the turn of the 20th century, joining communities of whites and Jews, Chinese and Japanese, old Californios, new Mexican immigrants, as well as immigrants from other backgrounds. The majority of new Black migrants relocated from southern states, like those who moved to the northeastern part of the United States. African Americans moving to California and other western parts also acted to escape the worst of Jim Crow era anti-Black racial restrictions. African Americans, similar to others who moved to the state, embraced the booster promoted California dream of the leisure lifestyle in picturesque outdoor settings and new life opportunities, even while discrimination and lax enforcement of California's civil rights laws, implemented as early as 1893, for decades into the 20th century, prevented them from using various public and private facilities and buying land in many areas. Today, my brief remarks arise out of my new book titled Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era. And I will explore little technical difficulty there. I will explore the book's subject of how African Americans made California an American history by challenging racial and class structures when they occupied recreational sites and public space at the core of the state's formative mid-20th century identity. These sites became contested ground in the development of attractive inland resorts and beaches relatively free from white citizens' harassment. In Los Angeles, recreation and relaxation was an essential component of liberty and a distinctive civil concern in the nation's long freedom rights struggle. I will also share some ways I, as a historian and others, have used a few of these stories to engage audiences in history as well as heritage and nature conservation and social and environmental justice education in some places more successfully than in others. I offer a view of erased extraordinary community builders and social economic development experiences of Black people of Los Angeles and California. Doctors, teachers, lawyers, entrepreneurs, and strivers who were of other employment backgrounds. I will call out a few of these community builders and their efforts, but you're going to have to buy and read the book to really learn about these people. My work charts new directions for the study of the African American experience in the West to offer a broader view of the agents and the impact of leisure that intersects with the new scholarship about the influence of diverse outputs of the Harlem Renaissance and the new Negro experience as a cultural movement and national and global phenomenon. These stories of economic development, initiative, and civil rights struggle add new information and understanding about how African Americans sought to seize their California dream to appropriate and shape the offerings of their new environment in the far West. As the Reverend Darius Stokes quote alluded to, as his quote alluded to, the search for the American dream in real and mythologized opportunities offered by the California dream transcends time and ethnicity from the colonial period to the 20th century. When the American and Western ideals and mythologies are combined with the romanticized California, Spanish, and Mexican heritage, the region's beautiful landscape and its warm climate and a reputation for tolerance and inclusiveness and the pioneering spirit, the fully developed California dream emerges. Today, I offer a view of the first study to illuminate these sites and their ignored, unrecognized voices to offer a better understanding of the past and challenge the cultural social meaning of these places and the politics of space. These stories I have recast the significance, meaning, and place of leisure by recognizing African American leadership and action, therefore giving a more complex understanding of the American experience in the West and California, where racial discrimination existed in practice rather than legally, as in many other states of the nation in the post-enslavement modern capitalist era. In contrast to the city where African Americans lived, California's waterfront and pastoral places where they went to relax and invest and invested in real estate included Bruce's Beach in Manhattan Beach and Santa Monica's Bay Street Beach, which was sometimes controversially called the Inkwell, and Eureka Villa in Santa Clarita Valley. All of these were in Los Angeles County. Others were at Lake Elsinore and Corona's Park Ridge Country Club in Riverside County, and then there's a few others that I discuss in the book also. The public memory of African American leisure destinations in California communities remains a political issue for some that complicates defining a public past for citizens and their civic identity. The social meaning of these places and their histories is a powerful tool in developing a more inclusive definition of the collective past and civic identity that includes African Americans. The stories of California's largest and most most popular, though not broadly remembered, African-American leisure destinations were sites of pleasure, sites of civil rights and contestation and economic development that flourished for different time periods between the 1900s to the 1960s. These are the stories of public and private memories of African Americans of all socioeconomic classes, the new Negroes who migrated out of the US South to northern, Midwestern, and far Western cities in the post-World War I decades to escape racial injustices. These migrants, including soldiers who arrived home from Europe after the Great War, they were all much more self-confident and sometimes militant and demanded their rights as citizens and consumers. Many stories about this struggle at these places are being lost, along with the structures which housed various leisure experiences, because our society has neglected to recognize and document them. As critical as it is to the understanding of the larger struggle for freedom and equality made in this history, the documentation of these cultural landscapes is valuable in its own right, since it offers important information to historians and the general public to give a fuller truth about the ethnic diversity of California and the West. A romantic ideal of leisure as a way of life, or as, quote, a permanent way of life, unquote, in Southern California has been a recurring regional promotion and additional attraction for tourists and migrants over the last century. The consumption of leisure as a particular lifestyle and a performance vehicle of various social practices to gain fulfillment, self-determination, and uplift became a new forceful marker in the claim of middle-class status, place, and American citizenship and culture that spread from California to the rest of the United States beginning early in the 20th century. Race, power, place, privilege, and wealth often informed leisure opportunities, just as it determined who was able to take advantage of economic and social opportunities in California. Even with their impacts, African-American leisure builders and seekers, through creative assertion, claimed and performed full social and civic membership and social and economic resourcefulness. As Californians undertook leisure, many found it restricted and themselves excluded from the way of life. Racial and economic group communities, racial and ethnic group communities encountered restrictions by the white majority population, which prevented them from fully taking advantage of the state's opportunities and amenities. Leisure became a site to separate and segregate, to control and regulate people, places, and opportunities. White boosters broadcast this rhetoric and imagery about leisure lifestyle pleasures as messages in mass media, speaking to white consumers to create a sense of place in California's social and physical landscape that excluded Jews and people of color. In the white boosters' message, communities of color were situated as laborers, if at all, rather than neighbors or social equals. Ideas, practices, and expectations of leisure in the United States informed and challenged the vision and practice that African Americans pursued in California early in the 20th, and practices that African Americans pursued early in the 20th century. Therefore, as historians have analyzed and interpreted leisure as a social practice, they have recognized African Americans' leisure as a product of distinctive initiative and resourcefulness, cultural self-expression, self-determination, and political activism amid systematic exclusion and dispossession of public rights. African Americans made leisure integral to culture, community, and struggle in California during the 20th century. This history is layered with stories about group and individual circumstances and chronicles about migration patterns, socioeconomic status, cultural practices, and education and economic opportunities, and social power. These multifaceted, intersecting, and overlapping experiences and stories took place in public and private spaces. They are inseparable from one another in their composition and reflection of the structural racial exclusion and class exploitation imposed on African Americans and other people of color. African Americans joined others who moved to California in embracing the booster dream of a leisure lifestyle. They, at the same time, contested attempts of what the California Eagle newspaper identified as, quote, confinement to sordid forms of recreation and play, unquote, to assert self-determination in leisure. Astute African-American entrepreneurs and civic builders recognize how this embrace of leisure combined with real estate and other business opportunities could create income and wealth. As was the case with leisure and residential resort space near Eastern, Midwestern, and southern cities with relatively large African-American populations that sprouted up in the early 20th century, the race-specific leisure space of Southern California grew because there were entrepreneurs and residents in particular areas offering services and accommodations to African-American visitors. Regional social networking and community building, as well as cultural traditions and economic development of African Americans around leisure pursuits occurred at these sites, marking a space of Black identity on the regional landscape and social space. For the development of, the development of attractive and accessible Black beaches and leisure sites free from white harassment emerged as a major political issue in the long freedom rights struggle. Just as the leisure and resort spaces in other parts of the US were developed by African Americans during the Jim Crow era, in Southern California during this time, in Southern California, African Americans also developed these leisure spaces to promote the interests of the race and advance a complex mix of political perspectives and physical rejuvenation. Unwilling to accept exclusion, Black Angelenos, like their counterparts in other places, developed separate leisure spaces against oppressive racial subjugation of the era to promote a renewed sense of racial pride, cultural self-expression, economic independence, and progressive politics that were the embodiment of the new Negro determined to achieve a fuller participation in American society. These experiences and memories of these leisure spaces and destinations and the attention they gained in public memory and newspapers of the era offered African Americans new and broader visions of themselves, a new identity, and a new collective sense of freedom, contributing to cultural and intellectual efforts that define the new Negro. In California, African Americans' ambitions and initiatives for leisure space also radically claimed, challenged, and promoted the state's identity in the consumption of leisure as a lifestyle that would spread across the country to develop a new suburban middle-class culture. Black Angelenos transgressed social spaces as they asserted self-determination to participate in popular leisure and resort culture, social and economic trends that were considered modern by the 1920s. In ex-urban communities, African Americans bought property so they could control their enjoyment of these activities and contest white racism. Particularly, they were challenging white prejudice and power in the labeling of African Americans as laborers and as inferior. The leisure sites are worthy of remembering and commemorating because of the radical vision of principle and profit of those who tried to provide an opportunity via leadership in business ventures, land ownership, self-rejuvenation for African American and self-rejuvenation for African Americans to transcend race-based limits and control their own destiny, as well as the similar vision of those African Americans who seized the opportunity to use these sites. At these destinations, they were negotiating and performing their rights as citizens to shape the region's development as they pursued greater opportunities for economic advancement, social freedom, equity, and self-reinvention in California. In the historic context of Black Angeleno community formation and the development of California leisure destinations from their early 20th century beginnings, two stories unfold in the book. I elucidate the creative assertion of full social and civic membership and social and economic invention by African American leisure community agents. As the era's enterprise and constriction have largely been erased, I reconstruct and re-examine the destination sites, evolution and heritage stories of how they are remembered. Common and divergent patterns of many African American leisure retreats in California and across the US are important to reconstruct and preserve for the memory and heritage of these sites, and proper understanding of them as places of commerce, social networks, community, identity, contestation, and civil rights struggle. In the context of the changing US culture, along with the aspirational discourse of the California dream and Los Angeles community formation, and centrality of the California lifestyle ideal and its influence on the nation, African American consumers developed and consumed leisure in specific California geographic environments from the late 1800s into the 20th century and the new millennium of the 21st century. Each site has its own history of the development of leisure of a specific sort in social, political, and economic particulars, as well as racialized issues of the time and place. One of the earliest places African Americans went for recreation and relaxation was Lake Elsinore in Riverside County. It was a somewhat successful residential and leisure destination for the general population and African Americans through the middle decades of the 20th century. This was one of the furthest inland of the African American leisure spaces that existed from the 1900s to 1960s. The vagaries of the lake condition and changing leisure tastes and race relation dynamics over the years impacted African American entrepreneurs, resort business opportunities, and success. The African American presence has been left out of the local history narratives and landmark designation programming. This omission of the African American experience from heritage conservation programming obstructs our understanding of the full shared collective history of the range of community builders and their impact and contributions to the development of Lake Elsinore and the Southern California region. The Park Ridge Country Club in Corona in Riverside County was a private elite club and leisure space development originally built for a white-only clientele. A group of very ambitious African-American businessmen, Journey White, physician Eugene C. Nelson, and Clarence R. Bailey purchased the site to operate as an interracial space and an attempt at Black community suburbanization and elite recreation in 1927. The local elite and other white racist citizens strongly contested the African American reconstruction of this venture in the Corona community. The African American businessmen's effort to make the venture a success has been left out of the local history narrative, and there have been no local attempts to revive, there have been no local attempts of revival of this history or incorporation of it into the public record of the local community. And again, this is limiting our understanding of this community's historical actors and evolution. Eureka Villa, later known as Valverde in the Santa Clarita Valley of Los Angeles County, northern Los Angeles County, was initially an African-American planned resort development project with Euro-American partners that began in 1924. An early leader of this project was Black Angelino real estate impresario and booster Sidney P. Dones. At the same time this resort enterprise was emerging, there were other land development projects in direct competition with Eureka Villa for African American recreation and relaxation patronage and dollars. Public money contributed to the development of a park and swimming pool, and multiple marketing efforts by boosters, both Black and white, helped sustain interest of African American consumers' usage of the Hidden Canyon area until the crumbling of the racial apartheid era in the 1960s. By 2015, the Valverde community had been recast as one of the last rural areas remaining with affordable housing in the Santa Clarita Valley with limited public memory of the African American heritage. I'm going to share a bit more information about the African American experiences at the last two beach sites in Manhattan Beach and Santa Monica, so all will have more context in understanding the uses and implications of reconstructing the broader history for civic pride and community engagement activities. Bruce's Beach in Manhattan Beach in Los Angeles, in the southwest portion of Los Angeles County, was an early successful African-American residential resort and leisure destination, which opened in 1912. Black Californian pioneers, Willa and Charles Bruce, purchased Manhattan Beach land, where they built a resort business and where a small surrounding oceanfront African-American residential community developed. Eventually, racial exclusionary measures aided by destructive use of state power in 1925 eliminated their residential and economic development, with attempts to erase the site's memory from history. Only through political assertion has a limited revival of the history of Bruce's Beach and its incorporation into the public record emerged in the first decades of the 21st century. The Bruce's Beach community and its visitors were not alone in facing legal sanctions and private harassment actions that were discouraging of African Americans from visiting and settling in particular beach locations as the region's population increased during the 1920s. During this decade, several Save the Beaches campaigns were implemented to keep African Americans from creating or maintaining beachfront resorts. Similar cases to exclude African Americans occurred at other California beach towns in the 1920s. A few miles north of Bruce's Beach in 1925, African Americans were forced to give up on developing a beachfront resort in El Segundo. Numerous white-run civic and business groups, including some in the Santa Monica Bay, supported the action against the proposed El Segundo Beach Resort Plan. Other beach resorts suffered similar fates. The most violent intimidation campaign carried out by whites to evict African Americans from enjoying the beach was the destruction of the nearly completed Pacific Beach Club in Huntington Beach. Arsonists burned the beautiful new facility to the ground shortly before it was to open early in 1926. There were confrontations and assaults across decades, some of which turned violent, aimed to bar African Americans from public beaches. There were several of these violent altercations over decades which were aimed at keeping African Americans from using public beaches. And these are now and were the most coveted California recreation and relaxation destinations. Activists mounted legal challenges to these discriminatory practices endeavored by whites. Even with such white violence and attempts to evict African Americans from public beach space at various places along the Southern California coast, their communities' days of recreation and relaxation occurred unabated. African Americans were discreetly, publicly mindful in their oceanfront visits, but undeterred by Euro-Americans' attempts to harass, molest, intimidate, or restrict them from California's public beaches. In their first organized civil disobedience action in the region, members of the Los Angeles branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1927 challenged Manhattan Beach officials when they tried additional measures to make the beach white only. Although the Bruce's Beach community was raised, when the NAACP members staged a swim-in protest and legal maneuvers, clarification was one that African Americans had the legal right to enjoy this and all California beaches. In the coming decades, with this accomplishment, African Americans' more confident assertion of their legal rights contributed to racial restriction attempts at state public beaches fading away. The Afro-Angelinos were energized by this victory. At this time, the NAACP National Office proclaimed in a press release, this militant stance for civil rights in Southern California set a good backdrop for their 19th convention that would be held in Los Angeles in 1928. As the 20th century advanced, African Americans around the US would increasingly utilize legal actions and public protests to dismantle legally sanctioned, along with informally enforced discrimination and segregation in public accommodations. Eventually, in 1956, out of fear of legal consequences of the past in action by local Manhattan Beach officials, the vacant terrain once enjoyed by African Americans was transformed into a park. After various waves of local citizens, sometimes contentious public discussion about their municipalities' heritage over many years, in 2007, the site, not officially known as Bruce's Beach, was formally commemorated by Manhattan Beach city leaders with the Pacific Oceanfront Park named in its honor and a descriptive text plaque and a descriptive text plaque was placed there 80 years after the Black resort community was removed. The plaque has a lot of inaccuracies on it if you ever go down there and read it. The public commemoration opened up broader claims for not just public memory, but also American identity, even with the signage text that dilutes, misrepresents, and partially omits the site's historical truths and understanding. Fast forward to 2020, new energy has arisen to reclaim the important history of the Black-owned beach resort as a site of conscience and reflection at this time when racial inequalities have been laid bare in the last month. Bruce's Beach has been the event site of a memorial for Breonna Taylor, the young woman, emergency medical technician, young African-American woman, emergency medical technician in Kentucky that was shot dead in her home by police officers executing a drug warrant at the wrong place in March. It's been a celebration space of Father's Day and Juneteenth, which is the day, the June 19th day, the enslaved African Americans in Galveston, Texas learned the Civil War ended 2 years after President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863. They didn't learn that they were free until 1865. So more than 100 people with the new Black History Makers group showed up with balloons, cupcakes, flowers, and signs to commemorate Breonna Taylor's birthday in early June. Another group, the newly formed Anti-Racist Moms Around the South Bay, organized its inaugural event, a Juneteenth picnic held a week ago. The group wanted to show solidarity with with nationwide protests against systematic anti-Black racism and police brutality, which the Black Lives Matter movement has forced prominently onto the national agenda as part of a reclamation of and commitment to the Black freedom struggle. The MOM's mission is to create a safe space for Black people, other people of color, and allies to discuss and find solutions to end the cycle of racism, starting with their children. They want to create awareness of the history and the injustice done to Manhattan Beach's pioneering African-American families, to promote change in the hearts and minds of all, to move forward towards a fairer and more socially just society. Members have proposed getting the history of Bruce's Beach in the local school lessons. In 2007, I did presentations of this history at 2 different Manhattan Beach schools and worked with a local resident to do just this: get the history of Bruce's Beach into the lessons of the local schools. We were not successful with this endeavor at the time, but with the current social movement pressures, I am hopeful this education initiative will gain meaningful traction to be implemented in the Manhattan Beach schools and other regional schools. African Americans were able to build a sustained community in the city of Santa Monica, founded in the 1880s. A few blocks from the Pacific shoreline in the environs of what is today the southeast area of the Civic Center and near Phillips Chapel Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, the first African-American church established in the city, an African-American community developed. A short way south was a neighborhood which was also part of the Santa Monica African-American community. In the years surrounding Phillips Chapel's beginnings in 1908 at 4th and Bay Streets, the oceanfront area down the hill around Pico South, a few blocks to Bicknell Avenue, emerged as a gathering place where African Americans from all over Los Angeles County came to enjoy the beach's pleasures. While the boundaries shifted through time, it was a popular beach destination for African Americans from the 1900s to the 1960s. Many of the beachgoers once referred to this stretch of the coastline as the Bay Street Beach. Others sometimes called it the Inkwell. The latter name was most certainly derogatory and first used by whites, referring to the skin color of the beachgoers. Some African Americans reclaimed the name and used it as a badge of pride. Some who went to this beach never used this name for the place. And in contemporary times, there are many people who still would prefer the name not be used. Phillips Chapel and the families and extended clans of the Stouts, the Lawsons, the McCarrolls, the Brunsons, the Reeses, the Tabors, the Gordons, the Maxwells, and others formed the Santa Monica community that played an important role in drawing African Americans from across the Southern California region and beyond for recreation and relaxation at this beach. Accessible by streetcar near a thriving African American community centered around Phillips Chapel and a few Black-owned businesses, this beach gathering place with La Bonita and a few other guest house, eating places, tennis courts, volleyball nets, and other recreational opportunities became a place of refuge and community formation. In 1922, a group of African-American investors led by prominent attorney Charles S. Darden, who I had on a slide earlier just to show you. He was also a resort developer at Lake Elsinore. I didn't really talk about him, but I showed you a picture of him. And businessman Norman O. Houston, and Norman O. Houston, he would go on to become a founder of the Golden State Mutual Life Insurance Company and other businesses. So Darden and Houston sought to develop a first-class beach resort along the oceanfront at Pico Boulevard. The plan was met with protests from white residents and businessmen. Santa Monica City officials blocked the development from happening. After the Black Investment Group abandoned its plans, the property was purchased by white developers. The white group's plans for resorts were approved, and the iconic Casa del Mar, now a hotel, and another beach club, the Edgewater, now the hotel shutters on the beach, were built before 1930. Even with this and other new construction, African Americans kept their hold on the public beach space though they were pushed further south. They were able to avoid overtly physical hostile discrimination as the area evolved from the edge to the center of public activity. While racial discrimination and in particular restrictive real estate covenants prevented African Americans from buying property throughout the urban region, their community's presence and agency sustained their public space usage at the oceanfront in Santa Monica. This and other Southern California leisure spaces marked an African-American identity on the regional landscape and social space as they confronted the emergent power politics of leisure space and set the stage for these sites as places for remembrance of invention and public contest. The city of Santa Monica's 2005 landmark designation of Phillips Chapel Christian Methodist Episcopal Church set the stage in 2008 for the official recognition of the historic African-American gathering place at Bay Street and Oceanfront Walk, and Nick Gabaldon, the first documented surfer of African-American and Mexican descent in the Santa Monica Bay. In June 2019, this same area was honored with a listing as the Bay Street Beach Historic District on the National Register of Historic Places by the National Park Service for its significance in the African-American experience in US history. Gabaldon and other African-Americans' action to use this and other beaches embody the local stories that contribute to the national narrative of mass movement to open leisure space to all, demonstrating how the struggle for leisure and public space, along with political and economic issues, reshaped the long freedom rights struggle and civil rights movement. At recreation and relaxation spaces, despite systematized white racism in ethnically diverse Southern California, which was most consistently targeted at African Americans, they proved the racism of the region more readily contestable than elsewhere in the country. At Bay Street, the landmark designations infuse a cultural and natural resource site with complexities of human history and experiences, offering a critical dimension beyond beauty rarity, and environmental protection, which strengthens objectives of both the heritage and nature conservation movements. From a social and environmental justice viewpoint, the inclusion of this history is symbolic of important, limited social change which has occurred. Landmarking of the Santa Monica site pushes forth a sense of cultural belonging and common membership in American society that helps in forming a basis for social progress and action in the future. As a public historian, I have led coordination to facilitate remembrance of African American voices at Santa Monica's historical sites through the development of innovative public programming partnerships between several organizations, including the Santa Monica Conservancy and Heal the Bay and the Black Surfers Collective and other groups. The benefit of an ongoing investment in the pluralistic heritage and nature education through these partnerships is important to building future pathways to new, wider, and younger audiences, as well as established audiences in support of heritage and nature conservation ideals. This programming, such as Nick Gabaldon Day, International Coastal Cleanup Day, and field trips for youngsters from South Los Angeles, actively connects diverse publics to more complex, culturally inclusive stories of our collective national history, to social action, to beach access issues, ocean life, and watershed stewardship, intersecting with beach recreation. The nature conservation movement's engagement of broader and more culturally inclusive audiences is enhanced by developing the cultural and historical heritage of natural sites, such as the ones I've discussed today, to reach specific audiences and align with community values. Supporters of both heritage and nature conservation objectives must include the language of injustice, discrimination, inequality, and racism in discussions to acknowledge the continuing struggle to totally dismantle these conditions, which in more places than some may want to recognize continue inhibiting communities of color from full civic participation, human experiences, and civic society entitlements. Supporting these endeavors, I made a presentation to the California Coastal Commission early in 2019 to back their efforts to enact a social and environmental justice policy, which includes this language that I've just mentioned, and the recognition of the history and current conditions of disenfranchised communities to create a policy that is an important new operational step towards a more fully realized vision of coastal protection and access for all people to enjoy the state's coastline. As part of the Coastal Commission's policy mandate, the city of Santa Monica was asked to develop an education program to teach the public about the history of the African Americans who lived and worked in its Southern Civic Center area, which is in the coastal zone prior to the expansion, and other related waves of, prior to the Civic Center's expansion, and other related waves of urban renewal project, other related waves of urban renewal projects that displaced this community before the 1960s as part of the Belmar Park multi-purpose sports field construction plan. Interpretive history texts, panels, a permanent art installation, grade school lesson plans, and other education and information programming, including a website, will bring this area's history to life for present and future generations. And then here recently, in the last month, we have also at the beach site had the area used as a site of consciousness, the Bay Street Beach, sometimes called the Inkwell, as a site of consciousness to call attention to the racial inequalities and police brutality that has gone on, that we have been made aware of here in the last couple of months. And so this is another example of how this history is being used in terms of real time, in terms of the general community. The public commemoration of the Santa Monica Bay Historical African American Coastal Zone sites I have discussed today, and other similar sites throughout California and the nation, opens the door towards social and environmental justice by recognizing that communities of color have a right to historical and cultural sites, along with clean air, water, and clean water, and the enjoyment of America's natural resources. In closing, like many white Americans, Black Americans were lured to California for its opportunities and the good life imagery produced by writers, painters, photographers, and movie makers, which were used by various boosters promoting migration to the state. The stories and imagery of African Americans who participated in various phases of the Western migration and settlement continue to remain largely absent from the dominant mythologies and history surrounding the Western migration, notwithstanding investigations of the Black West published in the last 50 years. Today, I have briefly highlighted erased stories about African American agency and social economic investment in the California dream lifestyle at what have been called frontier of leisure destinations in Southern California from the 1900s to the 1960s. As well, the intersection of the stories in my book and the public process activities I discussed for education, remembrance, remembrance of our collective history, cultural identity, and stewardship action offer new ways to connect people with nature, culture, and historical heritage, and encourage visitation to these locations and others around the US. As a historian, I have and will continue to firmly engage in encouraging people to use history for these broader education programs, for wider equity and access for all people, for enjoyment of the California coastline and other American cultural and natural places now and in the future, and to help us look at how we can make a more just society in the future. I hope you will take time to learn about these forgotten Black Western pioneers and their undertakings, and ponder the implications of these stories for our lives today by buying my book and reading it. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts after you do. Thank you so much.
All right, guys, if you have any questions, now's a good time to ask And thank you, Allison, so much for being with us here today for this program. And once again, you can use the chat box or the Q&A box. I will read either one of them. And just so you know, we have an upcoming lecture on Sunday, July 12th is our next one. We will be exploring women's rights in Los Angeles. All right, I'm gonna give you guys 5 more seconds just in case this, oh, here we go. Janet says, thank you, Allison. Some history info I didn't know, very interesting. Linda asks, so very little activity in OC?
Is that a question?
That's a question. I believe she's, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Linda, but I believe she's asking, so there was very little activity in Orange County historically?
So most of the African Americans who moved to California in the early part of the century settled in Los Angeles. There were some African Americans who lived in different communities in Orange County in small numbers. And I did mention that in Huntington Beach, there was a beach club, the Pacific Beach Club, which I just mentioned it in passing, which was burned down in 1927. A group of African American investors from Los Angeles had built the club down there, and with a white partner, and the white supremacists burned it down before it was supposed to open. So if you're asking me about activity from that standpoint, that kind of put a damper on trying to do anything down there. And since the population of African Americans were were in the Los Angeles area, going to Santa Monica or to Manhattan Beach was probably a little easier than trying to develop again another place in Huntington Beach after the one that they did get built was burned down. We do have some records of some early African American settlers in actually in Huntington Beach. They were living there from the late teens forward, and they get mentioned occasionally in some of the Black press because people have gone down there to visit them.
All right, and Anonymous just says, thank you. I love this presentation and would love to see more. I never heard anything about Bruce's Beach, but I'm looking up all the info I can get.
Well, if you pick up my book, you'll really be able to learn about it.
Oh, let's see, Linda's asking a follow-up. So it was on purpose? Was OC less receptive to African Americans than LA? I know the census population in 1920 was 231 and rose less than 100 more in 1930.
Yes, it was. That was why they didn't move to Orange County, because the white people there were not very friendly. Los Angeles was, the city of Los Angeles was an easier place for African Americans to settle. There had been a historic African American community in Los Angeles since the settlement of California as an American state in the 1850s. As one will remember, at that time, Los Angeles was the largest population center, even in the 19th century.
Okay, Anne asks, were there summer camps for children of African American heritage? I grew up in the Leimert Park neighborhood of LA in the 50s and 70s and wasn't aware of any of my childhood friends going away to camp in the summertime, as I know Caucasian kids did.
So there weren't any African American camps, like in some places in the East and in the South, there's particular traditions of African Americans going to particular camps. We didn't have that here because in California, There were many more public resources that were available, and so people would go to those public resources in different ways than they did in other parts of the country, because we had civil rights laws that said those places were open to you. Now, there were times throughout the 20th century where different communities tried to restrict access to using the public pools, to even using certain camps, but they were not consistently closed off to African Americans for say from the 1900s to the 1950s. It was like from maybe half of the 1920s to the early 1930s in terms of camps in Los Angeles, where they were trying to segregate communities of color. And I just don't think that we had the same tradition about going to camp here in California as in other places around the country. I grew up here. That wasn't something that I did. We didn't go to camp. My parents didn't send us to camp. I can't even remember if I went to day camp. I did go camping with the Girl Scouts, and I went camping with my family in Northern California, and it was cabin camping, and it was I think it was with Jack and Jill, if I recall correctly. But I think it has to do more with if that's something your family's into.
And Anne's follow-up to that is, she's the one who asked the question, so it was more of a local cultural difference.
From the standpoint of, yes. I mean, if your family wasn't into camp, then you weren't going to camp. I mean, it's like some kids, like my dad didn't like the beach, but my mother did, and so she took us to the beach. He didn't particularly want to go.
I've also been informed it's pronounced Limert. Thank you for that. Joyce says she went to camp with her 6th grade class with her school. And then Javina says, thank you, very informative. And I have memories of going to Val Verde as a kid. It was beautiful. And then Linda says, I'm working with Charmaine on the IMLS grant. Where would you suggest I look for evidence to show a less than receptive attitude of whites in OC newspapers?
Well, you just answered your own question. Look in OC newspapers. I'm not sure I understand maybe I don't understand the question.
I will give Linda some time to clarify if she'd like then. And just in case anyone missed my earlier message, this entire program has been recorded. So if you missed part of it, or you came in late, or you just want to see it again, it will be available later on this week through our website on YouTube. Something more, Linda says. She hasn't much found this far.
So one thing that she might look at is a dissertation by Daniel Cady, C-A-D-Y. And he looks at Orange County, and he looks at Orange County during the 1920s and some of the white working class activities during that time. And he discusses some of the issues surrounding the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. And then there's also there's different studies that have been done in recent times about the rise of the KKK. There was a book in the last couple of years that was done that talks about the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, and they have information in that book about Orange County. There's another book on the Ku Klux Klan that came out within the last 20 years that also talks about Orange County. So there may be, I'm not sure where you're looking for the material. So you might need to change your search terms a little bit. If you, in WorldCat, you could look in WorldCat. You need to be maybe looking for a broader array of resources. Like I said, I don't know, I'm not sure what you're looking at, so I can't, and this is, you know, kind of a question that's getting really specific. And if you want me to help you figure out some avenues for research, then you know how to reach me directly.
Linda says, thank you so much, Allison. Stay safe. She'll email you. And then Joyce just added that it was a school tradition to go to camp, and she went in 1966. All right, I believe, oh, one more comment coming in. Anne says, thank you for an informative lecture. I can't believe I grew up in Los Angeles, third generation Angelino, and never learned about this important part of Southern California history. Thanks also to the Homestead Museum. All right, guys, once again, thank you so much for attending, and thank you so much, Allison, for being our panelist. Everyone have a lovely day.
All right, thank you very much to the Homestead Museum and to everyone that came to the talk today.